room. So Jesse Endahl is co-founder and CSO of Fleetsmith, a company providing a true zero-touch Mac management solution that looks super easy to manage. I'm excited to learn about it on my own over the next month. Today, however, Jesse will be talking about security in Catalina. So please give him a warm welcome.
Are we good? Oh, there we go. Perfect. Okay. Hi, everyone. As mentioned, my name is Jesse. I am one of the co-founders of Fleetsmith, which, if you haven't heard of us, we're modern, secure MDM with some cool, unique features. Probably the coolest is our catalog, totally automated patch management. But this is not a vendor talk. So prior to founding Fleetsmith, I was a security engineer at Dropbox. When I first started there, I was an IT engineer. I was on that team for 1 year, then I moved over to security engineering and was on that team for 2.5 years, so there 3.5 years total. Saw a lot of growth. When I started, it was like 130 people. When I left, it was 1,600. And yeah, a lot of what I did there actually was sort of direct inspiration for Fleetsmith. The first big project I did there was Mac device management, figure out what we were going to do. And I took a page out of the Google Mac Ops team's book, and I went the open source route. I used Puppet and Monkey. Pretty cool. A lot of work, but very flexible and very powerful if you have the resources to do it. So that's some of my background. That's kind of what first got me into this whole intersection of IT and security, is the work that I did there. And yeah, part of the thing that gets me excited about going to work every day is just getting to hopefully raise the bar for security across the whole space, not just for us, but also every other MDM vendor. So previous security research that I've done in this space has been the Black Hat talk, a deep dive into macOS MDM and how it can be compromised. The focal point and the flashy part of that was around a specific vulnerability where you couldn't do certificate pinning on the install application MDM command. And as a result, the install enterprise application MDM command was introduced, which does allow for pinning, which is awesome, because now you can actually pin all the bootstrapping stages to make sure that a man-in-the-middle attack is not possible at any stage. But another cool part of it was, for my own understanding of how MDM works, I basically put together a graphic and detailed explanation of all the different stages of the Bootstrap process, all the way from the APIs that the resellers use, like CDW, for example, to Apple Business Manager and DEP and those servers, and just every stage of the process. So if you're curious about the 7 different stages of the Bootstrap process, the white paper that Max, my co-presenter, actually works at Dropbox, not on the security team though, we wrote a 50-plus page white paper on this, and it's on the internet. So check that out. And then most recently at Mac DevOps and XWorld, I did this talk on an enterprise security roadmap for macOS. And then I did this massive blog post and opened I think 50 different feedbacks with Apple on things that should change if people believe that the roadmap proposed is the right one. So check that out as well. And then I also talked about that on the Mac Admins podcast. So today, though, is all about macOS Catalina and the security changes that Apple has been making. So I should actually also have put a new bullet point on here, which was that I just gave a talk at Mac Sysadmin on an ecosystem security analysis of the Mac platform. And one of the things that I talked about at the very beginning of that talk, first 5 minutes, if you just go watch the video, is this concept of a root of trust analysis, meaning if you think about, the talk asked a simple question, by the time you hand a laptop to someone in your organization, a new hire, new employee if you're in a business setting, what are all the things that have to be true in order for that laptop to be considered secure at that point? And it's a real rabbit hole. It's all starts at manufacturing, secure boot, the T2 chip, up through the operating system, the file system. I mean, it's really nuts. And the reason I bring this up is because I'm going to use sort of the same analysis to frame the root of trust part, not the ecosystem security part, to frame some of the changes that Apple's been making in Catalina, because I think that's the way that it makes sense to think about these things. So without further ado, this talk is just going to cover basically all of those new things in Catalina. So this was already in the abstract you saw on the website. So I mentioned this briefly, but I don't know if you can see that. It's very small, but this is actually on the first few pages of the iOS security guide that Apple releases and updates basically every year. So I don't think they've updated it yet for iOS 13, but it was updated last year, and it's super detailed. This thing is really long, and the very first pages have this diagram, which really shows you what that concept is, that root of trust analysis. You can see it starts all the way down there with the root certificate authorities, the device key, into the crypto engine, part of the secure enclave, up through the kernel and the file system, OS partition, up through the rest of the operating system. So that's the type of framing that we'll use today. So the interesting thing about Catalina is that a lot of the changes that Apple's making under the hood actually focus on enforcing a much cleaner boundary and separation between these layers. So specifically the kernel space and the user space, basically where that arrow is, and then also actually a bit inside the file system area as well. So let us proceed. The different areas where Apple has touched and made changes at each layer in Catalina. So the first one is the kernel, and you'll see a bunch of different changes they made there. The next one is actually the file system, and the interesting thing here is that the file system is actually used for just general operating system security changes, but they're also relying on file system level separation for things involving MDM. So it's pretty clever. Next is privacy, which this is interesting because it's I feel like a new technical concept. Historically, people haven't thought of a privacy layer of an operating system, but it's clear that Apple is thinking of it this way. If you watch their presentations from WWDC, which I rewatched in preparation for this talk, the way they frame this is they talk about this privacy layer, and then underneath that, there's these two subsections of recording protections and data protections. And then the next layer up, application layer. So this is Gatekeeper and Notarization. And then the network layer. So this is going to be network connections that are being made. If you've ever heard Apple talk about app transport security and the changes they keep making in that over the years to make it more aggressive, that's what this bucket's about. Cool, so the kernel layer. The kernel layer, I would also bucket the read-only file system into this. They're very close if you looked at that chart at the beginning. The read-only file system is very interesting, and you'll see this kind of come up again when we talk about the MDM changes. But this is basically actually really impressive, similar to the change from HFS plus to APFS. That was just a magical silent transition for the vast majority of the world. Most people aren't even aware that their entire file system got converted when they upgraded their OS previously. Similarly, most people aren't aware that there's these massive changes to data separation happening in the Catalina upgrade. It just magically is done after you're done upgrading. But it's really cool because now, similar to what SIP does, where it slices off certain directories and says, no, the only thing that can touch this is as Apple processes in the kernel, and you can't touch these files. This is actually taking that concept and bringing it to the next level and saying, we're actually going to do that segmentation at the file system layer and have separate APFS containers, which is pretty awesome. So yeah, really what it says here, Apple's moved all of the system files onto Macintosh HD, which is where it's always lived. But the new thing is that all of the user data, your data, has moved to a new container called Macintosh HD-data. So pretty cool. System extensions, so this is really in that kernel category. There's really multiple things that Apple has done in Catalina to try to get us, the world, anyone aside from Apple, out of the kernel to enforce that clean boundary separation. So the first is system extensions. And so this is really saying, hey developers, if you've previously used a kernel extension to do the really low-level stuff you need to do, don't do that anymore, and instead use system extensions. So this is the spiritual successor that is more secure, but hopefully allows the same functionality for developers. The second thing in this bucket is really geared towards like antivirus vendors. And I mentioned this in the security discussion that Ed Marzak led last night here. I think it was in the same room, about how I recently went to Stripe, the payment startup. I went to something called Stripe Sessions that they hold, I think, once a year. And there was an amazing security talk about like when data contradicts security. I don't think it was called best practices, but like security truisms. And one of the surprising things that they found is something that I'd heard kind of anecdotally mentioned, but never seen really backed by data. And they did show, reference some data around the fact that some of the most insecure and vulnerability-ridden software in the world is actually security software. And it makes perfect sense because this type of software operates in the kernel and is introducing essentially more surface area to the most delicate area of the operating system. So obviously Apple's aware of that, but they also are aware of the fact that people do still need the functionality that those products enable, which is detection of attacker activity. And so I'm very heartened to see actually that they do realize that that is a true need in the world, that people do need this detection capability, but they're being clever and they're trying to make it safer to actually get at that type of data. So that's what the endpoint security framework's all about. This will be very interesting for like antivirus vendors and endpoint security vendors because they're probably going to have to rewrite a lot of their products because they can't use kernel extensions anymore. That transition I think hasn't happened yet, but it's clear to me that the reason for this is to get rid of kernel extensions. So the one thing I do want to call out though is that I personally don't view this as a replacement for a generic audit log system baked into the operating system, where this would be something similar to what currently exists in macOS called OpenBSM logs. They were introduced a very long time ago, I think in 10.7 or something. And this gives you kernel level event monitoring of things like file creations, anytime a network socket is opened, etc. And this is really critical for detecting like advanced attacker activity, which not every organization needs that, but the ones that do, it's incredibly important to get this data. And actually, the blog post I mentioned at the beginning talks about what a modernized version of OpenBSM and AuditD could look like, including like a mock-up of the JSON that I think would be valuable to security teams. So, endpoint security, super exciting. Same goal, get people out of the kernel. And one little footnote. This is a change in Catalina. If you are, loading kernel extensions, they now require a reboot of the OS before they'll actually load. So please, keep that in mind if you do have kernel extensions in your environment. All right, file system layer. So the interesting thing about this is that, like I mentioned earlier, the user enrollment feature in MDM leverages file system layer things as well. So this is why I think I'm guessing we'll see more of this. I'm not sure how, but given how powerful this like separation of data is through APFS, I wouldn't be surprised if we see it leveraged for even more things in the future. But the cool thing here is that it actually separates out the. Is everyone familiar with user enrollment, first of all, before I move on? Awesome. So for anyone who's not familiar, this is a third type of enrollment for MDM devices. Historically, we've had like the user enrollment, kind of the one we're all used to, like download a config profile and hit install, hit allow, and then boom, your device is managed. The second one, obviously, has been historically called DEP. Now it's called automated device enrollment. And now this is the third category, which is really meant for BYOD devices, where you as the company might not need full control over that device, but you do want to do some very basic things. So it's a very lightweight management, and it's very privacy preserving to the user or employee. So the cool thing here is that it's kind of a best of both worlds because the corporate data is actually kept on a separate container, and then the user data is kept on a separate container. And if you actually unenroll the device, that separate volume with the corporate data is just deleted, removing everything, but the user's personal stuff is basically left untouched. So I think this goal of this is to get more people to essentially be comfortable with BYOD device enrollment because even if it's their own personal device, they can have assurances that the company or the organization just isn't going to have full, total control over their device and be able to, remote wipe it with the click of a button, for example. So device identity, this is actually very important for everyone here to know, and I would say also for MDM vendors to know, because it has implications on how inventory features work. Like historically, we're all used to enrolling devices and seeing like a list of serial numbers associated with people, right? You can't do that with user enrollment because you don't actually get the serial number or the IMEI or the UDID, really any device identifier at all that is permanent. You get a basically randomized anonymous identifier that's good for the lifetime of the enrollment, but as soon as you unenroll and re-enroll, that's going to basically seem like a brand new device. So vendors and IT and security are going to have to find new ways to think about the inventory of these devices. And as I mentioned, no ability to remote wipe, clear passcodes, anything that could be deemed like invasive to the end user. And yeah, that extends to other things about the state of the device, like app inventory. You can only see like the things that you have installed through MDM. You can't just see like a list of all the apps they have installed, which makes sense because people's phones are very personal and they can have tons of different types of apps on there that they might not want their employer or organization to even see the names of those apps. So makes sense. And hat tip to Simple MDM, they have a really nice blog post that I referenced putting together this section on user enrollment. So data layer, this is that like privacy, user data, and recording stuff. So there's a bunch of changes to TCC, which Apple calls user privacy protections in their slides. So I'm going to use the same terminology here. And this is really around access to different folders on the system, as well as different data that's not necessarily stored like on a traditional folder on disk, but which is sensitive, such as contacts, mail, etc. So these are the new data protections that you can actually manage as well. I'll have that slide later. But you've got protections on in Mojave on contacts, calendars, and reminders, and photos, and that's kind of the like Apple data. But now it's extended to these folders, desktop documents, downloads, iCloud Drive, etc. So this was also an interesting concept that they introduced at WWDC, is the distinction between user consent and user intent. And I thought this was really clever. And it shows that even though I think I've seen criticism on Twitter and elsewhere around like all the pop-ups that you might see during an upgrade to Catalina around access to various things, allowing notifications, etc. The fact that Apple's making this distinction between user consent and user intent is very heartening to me, that they're aware of like dialogue fatigue and these types of issues, even if they can't avoid it entirely. They are definitely making an attempt here, because the cool thing about the user intent is if they can essentially infer what the intent of the user was through like a click or an in-app action, they're purposefully not triggering a pop-up for user consent. They're just letting it happen, like letting it through. So that's pretty cool. I think it would be awesome to see more of that. I'm not sure exactly if that's even possible. Like maybe the kind of user intent thing is already being used in all the areas it can be. But I really like the concept. And as mentioned, you can manage all of these things through MDM. With some caveats. So in terms of the recording stuff, like keyboard recording and screen capture, screen recording, stuff like that, you can only manage it to the deny setting. So you cannot whitelist that, which, given how invasive that can be, I do understand the motivation. I think it also does complicate things, though. Let's say if you're trying to push out your video conferencing software to your company, and you want that to just work out of the box for everyone at your organization, this can be somewhat of a roadblock where if a new employee doesn't understand what that dialogue is for and they hit deny, that could actually trigger some help desk tickets. And you might actually have to have some help center articles kind of walking people through, hey, if it's not working, go open system preferences, go hit approve. Otherwise, it's not going to work. So the application layer, this is really like whenever you are executing code on your machine. So you've got historically Gatekeeper, but the interesting thing about Gatekeeper is it's sort of like the brand name for a bunch of different lower level technologies behind the scenes. So the biggest changes here span actually multiple stages of what is called Gatekeeper. So in one of the security talks at DubDub, Apple explained that the different stages here, the Gatekeeper stages are actually these 4 stages. So stage 1 is, when you're trying to launch this application, does it actually contain known malicious content? And they've made some improvements there. The second is, has it actually been tampered with? So this is where the Apple developer certificates and signing come into play. 3 is, does it meet the security policy? And 4 is, does the user actually want to run this? And so that's where you could see some prompts pop up. So they've actually made improvements to multiple parts of those stages. So just imagine, numbers 1 through 4 on the left-hand side there. So you can see that malicious content scan is the first thing that happens. The parts in white there are the parts that have always existed, or at least have existed for this last several versions of macOS. And the stuff that you see in green is the parts that are new. So as you can see, things that were launched via the UI, like literally people clicking on things in the Finder, in the Applications folder, etc., those were the only things that were actually protected by Gatekeeper before Catalina. And even so, there was no step 3 essentially before. That's brand new. So a lot of improvements here. I think more than people realize, because this slide is just like really brief in the presentation. But the really awesome thing is that now even command line tools are protected. One interesting thing that I should point out here is that the quarantine flag, which is what triggers all of this to happen, it's basically only added to the file if it's loaded from somewhere else. So if it's just magically on the machine somehow, none of this would apply except for the content scan. But the other 3 stages here only happen if the file has that little quarantine flag applied to it, and that only gets added by the operating system if it's like downloaded, for example, from a browser, or coming in from like another source. So I thought that was also clever, the more I thought about it, because it shows again that they're trying to avoid that dialogue fatigue by not prompting people, for example, in like the first launch prompt, if it didn't come from like a potentially dangerous source like the internet. I think that's actually one more thing to mention here. The notarization stuff is very interesting. They had actually initially said that all software had to be notarized with the runtime hardening flags enabled, which enables like a bunch of extra protections so that malware can't mess with the process once it's running. But that deadline has been extended to, I think, early next year. But this is a really exciting change because it's bringing the security model of macOS much closer in terms of the application runtime security to iOS, but doing it in a much different way than iOS had done. Network layer. So I also talked about this briefly in the ecosystem security talk at Maxis Admin because I thought it's a super interesting example of Apple using their vantage point as the kind of platform steward of macOS to force changes on systems that they actually don't control, like remote servers, right? They can't just call up another company and say, like, or even MDM vendors and say, like, hey, DevOps team, you have to change your server configs. Like there's no, they could do that and it might work, but it wouldn't be 100% foolproof. But they've done something really clever, and they've said, starting in macOS 10.15 Catalina, as well as iOS 13, they're actually saying, hey, the operating system won't make connections to remote servers unless the server certificates meet these requirements that the operating system actually expects. So this is really clever, and they've also done this in a relatively gentle way by just saying this only applies to new server certificates issued after July 1st, 2019. So that way, any existing server certs that you already have, you don't have to scramble and try to rotate those. But whenever those come up for renewal, this will slowly improve the kind of security of the whole ecosystem for anything that Mac and iOS devices are connecting to. So pretty cool. And MDM changes. So there's actually a bunch of changes in MDM. They kind of were spread out across multiple different talks and different support docs and whatnot. So I think a lot of people don't realize how many changes actually were made because they were kind of all spread out. But one of the biggest ones is this trend to kind of bring the macOS security model more in line with iOS and really bring true supervision to the Mac. It's existed for a while, but it hasn't really given you much different than managing the device any other way, like through user-approved MDM, for example. But that is starting to change. And there's not many things currently in Catalina that require supervision, but I think we're going to see more in the future. One thing I do want to note is that there are certain things that I believe should not live behind supervision that currently do. In particular, this is the one I feel most passionately about. The MDM command for major macOS upgrades actually doesn't work on user-approved MDM. The device has to be supervised. And to me, that's counterproductive to the security goals of getting everyone on the latest operating system that has all these great security improvements. If you actually are hampered in your ability to do that because you can only upgrade devices that are already supervised, that's there's a bit of dissonance there for me. So if you agree with this and you'd like to dupe the feedback ID, that's the feedback ID for that one. Bootstrap tokens. So Bootstrap tokens is really just a proxy for getting a secure token, roughly speaking. So for those not familiar with secure token, this was, I can't remember which version it was introduced in, I think Mojave, in a dot release, I believe. But it makes it so that the only users on the system, the only Mac accounts on the system that are able to unlock or enable file vault at all and then unlock the disk are users that are blessed with this special attribute within the user directory in macOS. And it's this attribute that literally says secure token. And if the account doesn't have that attribute, it can't enable file vault and it can't unlock the disk. So the interesting thing here is that the way that this was initially implemented, only the very first account that was created on the Mac through the setup assistant or through an MDM command would get a secure token associated with it. And so if you had any other workflow that you were relying on for setting up new devices, you could run into some major problems here and end up having to do some kind of acrobatics to figure out how to get secure tokens associated with new accounts. So the Bootstrap token concept is pretty cool because it basically makes it so that the MDM server can say, no, this account should get a secure token. And it in particular addresses the problem around workflows or environments that rely on macOS mobile accounts. So now mobile accounts can get secure tokens from MDM servers is basically what Bootstrap tokens gets you. Next, we've got the Find My updates. So Find My Mac, Find My iPhone, etc. And there's some really cool improvements here, not super related to MDM specifically, but the offline finding stuff. If you haven't seen this, it's really cool. They actually, Wired wrote up a pretty good article on it. And essentially it uses Bluetooth beaconing between Apple devices, even if they're not on Wi-Fi or don't have cell connection, combined with public key cryptography and aggressive key rotation to make it so that devices are constantly like sending their last known location to other Apple devices in the vicinity, but in such a way that preserves privacy, so that even Apple doesn't really know at all where the devices actually are. So it's very clever, and the design seems sound. So that's really cool because obviously laptops don't have SIM cards, they don't have cellular, so it's very unlikely that it's a much lower chance that your Mac will show up historically on Find My Mac than your iPhone would if it's lost or stolen. And now that hopefully will no longer be the case as everyone upgrades to Catalina. So the interesting thing about this too is it's really kind of in line with that phrase I used at the beginning of like secure by design. This is like kind of the same thing, but like privacy by design. So I think it's really a great example of something that actually improves the product experience for people at the same time as it's actually pushing the boundary for privacy engineering and security engineering. So I love when those things can actually happen together because it's very difficult. Oftentimes security and privacy come at the trade-off of a better user experience. And so it's really cool to see when they can actually help each other's goals. Activation lock. So I think this is a very interesting one. So how many people are familiar with activation lock? Awesome. So for those who aren't, it's a really cool feature. It makes it so that if your iPhone historically has been lost or stolen, when someone tries to wipe it, they'll see a thing that says, no, you have to enter like the iCloud passcode in order to disable, Find My iPhone. And even if they go crazy and like put it in a recovery mode and wipe it, they just won't be able to actually reactivate that device and start using it because it is the device is actually checking in with Apple servers when it first powers on, and if it's activation lock, they are not getting past that screen. And so it's a very powerful motivator against theft because thieves will know, they're going to be out of luck because the vast majority of devices will be activation locked because it's enabled automatically when the end user signs into iCloud, because Find My is also enabled automatically when you sign into iCloud. But what's really cool is they also have brought the ability to manage this stuff over to MDM. And so DEP devices don't get activation lock automatically enabled by Find My. And you can actually manage more of these settings as well with MDM and get like bypass codes to disable activation lock if needed. The trickier one is UAMDM devices because activation lock is automatically enabled when those users sign into iCloud. So be careful with those. Looks like I'm getting down on time, so I'm going to just rush through the rest here. But two other really exciting announcements around MDM. SSO Extensions, not specifically around MDM, but if you're familiar with Enterprise Connect, this is basically Apple released essentially a rewrite of Enterprise Connect using the new SSO extension framework. Super exciting, and that's extensible. So like, it's not just going to be limited to Active Directory. This can be used with other authentication. For a long time, I think. In the Setup Assistant screen, when you boot authentication at that stage of device enrollment, when the device is sitting in Setup Assistant, has been HTTP basic auth, which is not a very secure authentication method. Now, there's actually the ability for the MDM vendor to basically do any type of web screen that they want during Setup Assistant. So it could be used for authentication if that's what they want to do. It could also be used for showing like a privacy policy, consent text. It's very flexible, so super exciting change. And in conclusion, I just wanted to say that like it's very clear that Apple's moving very systematically through these layers and trying to strengthen those boundaries at each stage and with each macOS release. And I'm super excited to see what they continue to do in subsequent macOS releases in the future. Cool.
All right, thank you. Does anybody have any questions for Jesse?
Is it okay if I ask a question?
Their brains are bleeding. That's what it is. What's up?
So I'm really curious. How many of you are? Let's do both questions. How many of you are aggressively enforcing an upgrade to Catalina? Let's say in the next 3-month time period. Anyone? Awesome. How many of you are blocking Catalina? Okay, and this is my very exciting follow-up question. Maybe we can pass the mic around for anyone who wants to answer. But what are the reasons for blocking?
Old apps guaranteed to not work. That the company requires day to day.
It's a good reason.
Yeah, the amount of 32-bit still out there
Yep.
that has been either abandoned
Yep.
or is still in development because the developers didn't get the message early enough. It's
Yep.
crazy.
It seems to be still a moving target.
I'm curious what you mean by that.
I'm not sure what I exactly mean, but it seems to me that with all of the changes that are being presented to us or offered to us, that they constantly change, especially if you can change their way of thinking, especially with some of the things that you put in your show where you're aggressively pursuing or pushing them to make adjustments in their thinking, that we have to rearrange our thinking based on the community's ability to impact things after they've shipped the product, not before they've shipped the product.
I'm curious, can I ask a follow-up on that? What do people think would, I guess, improve that situation? This is really like an open discussion. Because I think I know what you're saying, but I'm trying to brainstorm now, like, if we were going to propose something to Apple, like, that would make things easier for these types of transitions, like what would we say? Product roadmaps. That's a good one.
You know, it's interesting. I was looking at their Microsoft has a script editor that they put up, and in the GitHub posting, they talked about having an in-game roadmap publicly posted. Like,
Interesting.
this is what we're doing. This is where we're headed eventually.
Interesting. And
So
that time
community
scale is like
I
years
didn't-
or?
I didn't look at what it actually
Got it,
was
got
or
it,
how
got it.
long out it was, but it was interesting that they were publicly saying, "Hey, this is where we're headed."
Yeah.
Not just next year, but like eventually.
That's cool. I like that.
You mean Microsoft User Voice, where you can vote on those features, and they're like, these are the top 3 that we're working on. This is where if you want something else for us to work on, please upvote it, and then that will get worked into the pipeline.
Interesting. I didn't realize I had that. That's cool.
Well, so I was looking at text editors, right? And VS Code came up, and so that was it.
That's awesome.
Just my own perspective on this. It's God, I've been doing this for a really long time, and it always seems that we're recommending to our clients that they wait for 2 to 3 dot revisions after an initial release of an operating system, because there's the debugging and stuff that goes on within the community before it goes gold master, but then once it gets released, it's in a much broader pool where it's being tested in real world, and you learn a lot.
Right.
Engineering learns a lot. They reiterate, right?
Yep.
Right.
That makes sense, yeah. Yeah, I think for me, there's always that tension between, any new release from any company, there's always going to be problems. I think that's universally fairly true. But I always struggle with the kind of holding back and missing out on all the security changes, because if I'm just thinking like from an attacker's point of view, like they love the fact that people don't upgrade immediately, because it's just basically like anytime, this is true of any company, not just Apple, but like anytime a CVE comes out, right, a new vulnerability, it's basically like a treasure map for attackers. They're like, oh, this vulnerability was patched, and this is how this is how it worked. Oh, I can develop an exploit for that, and make a one-click kind of like weaponized version of it. And so that's, I think, where the importance of like the fast patching comes in. But yeah, I actually don't have a great answer for this because that's why I asked the question, because I think there's this tension between like, well, people need to get their work done, and we have these apps from these vendors that are lagging behind where they need to be. So we're being essentially forced to be more insecure as an organization. And I'm not sure how to fix that. And I'm not even sure how to fix that if I was Apple, if that makes sense.
Yeah, this is just a seed of an idea I had as I was flying out here. Is I think that we're almost to the point that we need a professional or enterprise version of the OS.
Huh.
Because it seems like we're doing a lot of time putting down restrictions on a lot of things like photos and iTunes and locking down a lot of the things that are great for Apple and for consumers, but it's gotten big enough that maybe we need our own version of the operating system that could have a different timeline or something.
And really, that does
got
point
one
out
back there.
that there are a couple of different design
Approaches, yeah.
pathways, right? Like consumer, the iPhone, the scaling
Right.
goes one direction, and the pro, like if you have a video editing house, your needs are really different.
Yeah,
Right.
that's a good point.
I understand it, but Apple has geared all this stuff sort of mostly towards fleets, as we used the word yesterday in a workshop I was in. For those of us who deal with 1, 2, 5-person operations, the process of getting a DUNS number and getting them enrolled in MDM is the user considers it nothing but a total absolute, are you insane? Why am I doing all this? And it's very cumbersome to do it with that. You know, you got to have a personal phone call with Apple to the head of the company, and if they don't answer the questions right, it all gets blown away and start over again.
Are you referring to the DEP, automated device enrollment process?
Enrolling it into Business Manager,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
my clients don't buy DEPs.
Right.
They have machines when I show up.
Yep, makes sense.
Anybody else? Questions? Comments? Thoughts? All right, everybody, please give Jesse a warm thank you.